Welcome back to the Depth Dive. Today we're really pushing into some deep waters, moving beyond just history or narrative.
We are. We're looking at what you might call the structural engineering of the cosmos based on these sources.
Exactly. We're exploring a really profound theological framework. It touches on, the ultimate purpose of creation, what divine authority actually is, and this idea of perfect obedience being structurally necessary.
And I should say up front, these sources, they're dense. They're not exactly light reading.
No kidding.
They present this incredibly intricate, almost legalistic view of the universe. Cosmic laws, justice, validating God's commandments. It all ties back to one central figure and event.
Christ's life and death.
Precisely.
So our mission today, essentially, is to take this journey, what we often see as a spiritual path, and try to understand it as, well, a structural requirement, a kind of cosmic legal necessity.
That's a good way to put it.
We need to unpack this pretty stunning paradox, how the second Godhead, who the sources identify as the creator of everything.
Space, time, all of it.
Right. How he willingly becomes a creature, submits perfectly to the Father's law, and then, through that perfect obedience, he officially inherits, or maybe ratifies, his control over everything. Death, Hades, all governance.
Yeah, it's that difference between having an inherent right versus having a legally confirmed mandate recognized by all creation. That's what we're digging into.
Why wasn't his obedience just morally good? Why was it systemically required?
Exactly. Required to prove that the whole divine order, the commandments themselves that creation is supposedly built on, are fundamentally righteous and, crucially, livable.
Livable even for flawed creatures.
That's the core of the verification process these sources describe. They argue it's basically the whole point of the cosmos existing in the first place.
Okay, so a huge task ahead. Let's dive in. We'll start with that core paradox, the relationship between the Father and the Son during his earthly mission. All right, so right from the get-go, Christ's ministry presents this fundamental paradox. You have the Son defined as co-equal with the Father.
In essence, in deity.
Right, but on earth, he operates strictly, completely under the Father's direction, it feels like. Well, like a temporary dialing down of his own sovereignty, doesn't it?
It does seem that way, but the sources argue it's not about a reduction in his actual divine nature. It's more like a self-imposed limitation, specifically for the mission.
A functional limitation, maybe.
Exactly, a functional limitation. And Jesus himself, according to the texts, consistently emphasizes this dependence. He says things like, I can do nothing by myself unless I see the Father doing it.
That's John 5:19.
Correct. And it's less about his capability. He's still God, and more about the operational protocol. For this mission to be valid, cosmically and legally valid, every single action had to be a perfect mirror of the Father's will.
So help me understand this. If the Son, even though he's divine, were to, say, perform a miracle or make a judgment based purely on his own independent thought while in this creature form, that would somehow wreck the whole mission.
That's precisely the implication in these texts. This absolute dependence was essential. Why? To establish the unquestionable moral authority of everything he did and said, and especially the judgments he made.
Oh, okay.
He explicitly states his judgment is righteous because he seeks the Father's will, not his own.
John 5:30.
That's the one. If his own will, his personal creaturely perspective had crept in, the judgment wouldn't carry that weight. It wouldn't be the pure, unadulterated judgment of God the Father delivered impartially through the Son. It would lose its cosmic legal standing.
It sets up this incredibly high standard of delegation, almost like an ambassador who can only say exactly what the sovereign instructed. Any deviation invalidates the message.
That's a very good analogy. The Son had to perfectly represent the sender. Otherwise, the message and any subsequent legal action based on it could be challenged as being, tainted by personal interest or perspective.
So it's like he's embodying the perfect execution of a divine directive.
Absolutely. Think of it almost like a perfectly coded program. It only runs the instructions given by the architect. Christ's entire incarnate life, according to these sources, was programmed, so to speak, by the Father's will.
Even coming down from heaven.
Even that. His descent wasn't some independent whim. It was solely, explicitly, to perform the will of the one who sent him. John 6.3839 makes that clear.
So the Father's will wasn't just a suggestion box.
Not at all. It was the absolute, unchangeable blueprint for every word, every action, every moment of the incarnation.
And understanding this structural alignment, this perfect submission, is really the key to grasping the scope of the mission, isn't it? It wasn't just teaching or healing.
No, it was demonstrating, under the most challenging conditions imaginable being human, the flawless execution of the divine will.
Proving it could be done.
Yes, proving it could be done. And importantly, that obedience extended to protection, too. Part of the Father's will was that none given to him should be lost, except, the one destined for destruction.
Yeah.
Right, so his work was comprehensive, both in carrying out the actions and ensuring the intended outcomes, which is foundational for the next point we need to cover, this idea of mutual witness and validation. Hashtag 1.2, the mutual witness and divine presence.
Okay, so we have this perfect alignment, this total submission of the Son's will to the Father's. But then the sources emphasize that this needed to be, witnessed, publicly affirmed. Why wasn't Christ's own testimony enough? Isn't the Creator's word inherently true?
Logically, yes. The Creator's word is truth. But remember the context these sources establish. It's a cosmic legal framework. There's a dispute, a challenge to God's law underway.
The challenge from Satan we'll get into later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for the sake of created beings, angels and humans who are observing this cosmic drama, Christ's testimony about himself required external validation. He says it himself, I have another who testifies concerning me.
And I know that the testimony which she gives concerning me is true. John 5.31-32.
Precisely. This establishes the necessary dual witness, satisfying a kind of legal requirement for confirming the truth and righteousness of his claims and actions.
So it's not about God needing validation for himself, but about providing incontrovertible proof within the created order's understanding of justice.
That's the idea. When Christ judged, he emphasized he wasn't alone. The center, the Father, was with him. John 8.16 and 18.
So that dual presence guarantees the judgment carries the full weight, the unimpeachable authority of the first Godhead. It counters any potential claim of, say, bias or subjective error from Christ in his human capacity.
It removes all wiggle room for doubt, essentially. And this connection, this alignment, wasn't just for show at specific moments of judgment, it was constant. He confidently states he always did what pleased the Father.
Which is why the Father never left him alone. John 8.29. That implies that if he had disobeyed, even slightly, that divine presence, that connection would have been broken. Abandonment would signal failure.
That's a really critical point. That unbroken presence of the Father acts as a kind of continuous seal, verifying his ongoing perfect adherence to the plan. It's the constant validation.
And this perfect unity, this constant presence, leads to that incredibly profound statement you mentioned earlier.
Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. John 14.9.
Which essentially means the entire earthly mission, the teachings, miracles, judgments. It wasn't just the Son acting for the Father, it was, in a very real sense, the Father acting through the creature form of the Son, a perfect vessel.
The sources state that explicitly, too. Christ says the words he spoke weren't his own, but the Father dwelling within him, performing his works. John 14.10. The Son basically made himself the perfect, transparent conduit for the Father's will and power.
So if we wrap up this first section on obedience, Christ completes the work given to him. He glorifies the Father on earth. John 17.4. This isn't just him saying mission accomplished. It's the successful fulfillment of a cosmic legal requirement for his existence as the God-man.
Yes. And crucially, that successful completion, that perfect obedience as a creature, is the foundation stone for his subsequent authority over creatures.
You can't command until you've obeyed.
In this framework, yes. Only the one who has perfectly submitted their will to the divine law, validating the Father's judgment and glory in the process, earns the right, in the eyes of all creation, to then command others. Personal obedience precedes legitimate authority. He who perfectly executes the command then has the right to require others to willingly submit to that same, now validated standard.
Which means his entire earthly life, every moment of submission, was actually a necessary prerequisite for the cosmic authority. He'd fully assume later. It wasn't just about setting an example, it was about qualifying for the role.
Exactly. It was the ultimate qualification process.
Okay, so if the life was about perfect moment-by-moment obedience, then the climax, the cross, has to be understood in the same light. It's the ultimate act of submission, but the sources frame it not just as suffering, but as a strategic, voluntary exercise of, delegated authority.
This is absolutely vital for understanding the atonement through the lens of these texts. When Christ faces the cross, he does willingly accept the cup given by the Father, right? John 18.11. But, and this is key, his willingness is backed by sovereign authority, not by helplessness or victimhood.
He wasn't just swept along by events.
Not at all. How do the sources define that authority he possessed?
He says He has the exousia, the authority, the power, and the right to lay down his psyche.
Right, and we need to be careful with that word psyche. It's often just life or soul. But here, the sources seem to use it to mean the creaturely life essence itself, the soul animating the human body.
Okay, so he has authority over his own creaturely soul.
Yes, he has the authority to lay it down, and crucially the authority to take it up again. That's John 10.1 scene 18. And notice the language. This authority, this action was a commandment he received from the Father.
Wait, a commandment. That really doubles down on the legal, almost contractual nature of it. It wasn't just that he could die or was allowed to die. He was commanded to strategically abandon his soul, and he possessed the inherent divine right, as the Son, to carry out that command within his creaturely existence.
Exactly. That shifts the entire narrative, doesn't it? He's not a passive victim of Roman soldiers or Jewish leaders. He's the active agent, the sovereign under orders, orchestrating his own strategic sacrifice according to a divine mandate.
It completely reframes the power dynamics of the crucifixion.
It really does. The sources are adamant. He was not a victim in the ultimate sense. He was the sovereign acting under a supreme pre-agreed authority. And the implications for understanding who actually held the power in that moment, well, they're huge.
You mean regarding Satan and the forces arrayed against him?
Yes. The argument presented is compelling. Satan, Pilate, none of them could have actually killed Christ without Christ's own permission. His allowance. Remember John 19.11. Pilate claims authority. Jesus corrects him. The authority comes from above.
So Christ actively used his divine authority to abandon his soul, which then allowed the physical process of execution to proceed.
Precisely. He controlled the timing and the mechanism of his own death by withdrawing his sustaining life force. Now, that allowance doesn't excuse the perpetrators, of course. Their sin, especially Satan's in orchestrating it, remains the greater sin. But the event itself was controlled, managed by Christ. He orchestrated the abandonment of his soul to fulfill the Father's commandment and serve the larger cosmic plan.
So the death on the cross was a planned, strategic desertion of the psyche from the body, executed by the Son using his own delegated authority, fulfilling a legal requirement.
Wow. Okay, that leads us directly to the next crucial piece, defining what exactly this powerful, authoritative act was designed to confront and overcome. What is death in this framework? Hashtag 2.2, defining and overcoming death.
Right. Let's pivot to death itself, because we often think of it as this, abstract force or the ultimate end. But these sources define death very differently. It's presented as,
Well, as a creature.
death is a creature, like an angel or a human.
In the sense that it's part of the created order and subject entirely to God's control. Romans 8.38 lists death among created things that cannot separate us from God's love. It's a tool within the divine administration, not an independent power.
So not a primordial force opposing God, but an entity he uses for a purpose within his structure.
Exactly. God uses death primarily as the consequence separator for sin, separating the psychical body from the soul. But the sources are clear. Death isn't permanent. It has an expiration date. God will ultimately destroy it, throw it into the lake of fire. Revelation 20.14.
Okay, understanding death as a created tool, not an ultimate power, is fundamental to grasping Christ's victory then.
Absolutely. It changes the whole game. Now, this creature, death, operates under a specific law. What empowers it? What gives it its sting?
The sources point to sin. 1 Corinthians 15.56 says the sting of death is sin.
And the power of sin is the law. Correct. So the structural law of the cosmos is rigid here. Death is the enforcer, the wage payer for violations of the law. Sin gives death its legal right to act. Therefore, to experience death in its fullest sense, the spiritual separation, the penalty one must have committed a crime against God's law. Sin is the prerequisite for death's claim.
Which brings us right back to Christ's identity. Since he was sinless,
Death had no legal claim on him, none whatsoever.
Hebrews 4.15, tempted in all points as we are, yet without sin.
Exactly. Because he was legally innocent, because he perfectly fulfilled the very law that empowers death, death structurally could not hold him. Acts 2.24 says it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him.
Impossible not just because he was God, but because he was a sinless man.
Yes. If death had held him, it would imply one of two things. Either the law itself was flawed, or Christ had in fact sinned. His release was proof of his innocence and the law's integrity. His sinlessness was the structural block that prevented death from claiming him permanently.
And this perfect sinlessness is what makes the substitutionary aspect possible. Why can't, according to these sources, one sinner die for another?
Because a sinner is already under the sentence of death. They're described as dead in sin, spiritually cut off from God's life, as Ephesians 4:18 puts it. Their death is already owed to the law as payment for their own sin. You can't pay someone else's debt with money you already owe for your own debt.
It wouldn't be a valid payment.
Exactly. Only someone perfectly clean, someone who owed nothing to the law, could step in and bear the curse, pay the penalty, without being legitimately claimed by that curse forever. His life, being untainted, had infinite value, capable of covering the debt.
Okay, this makes the distinction the sources draw between the two kinds of death, first death and second death, absolutely critical. Let's slow down and really nail down these definitions for everyone listening.
Good idea. The sources distinguish two phases, or maybe types, of death. The first death, is described as a composite event. It includes what we call earthly death, the physical body returning to dust, the separation of soul and body. But crucially, it also includes the spiritual consequence for the unredeemed, abandonment death, being cut off from God.
So first death, physical death plus spiritual abandonment for the lost.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Then there's the second death. This is the final, ultimate, irreversible separation. Eternal punishment, defined as the lake of fire.
And Christ on the cross bore the penalty for humanity's sin by experiencing the worst part of the first death.
He experienced the abandonment death aspect, that cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" From Matthew 27:4-6. That's interpreted as him bearing the full weight of humanity's sins, as Isaiah 53:5 describes, and experiencing that terrifying spiritual severance from the Father that is the core penalty of the first death for the wicked.
He took the spiritual death component for us.
Yes. Which means, for those who are united with him through faith, their connection saves them from that abandonment death. They still experience earthly death, the body returning to dust, but it's reframed as sleep because the sting, the spiritual separation, is removed. They bypass the core penalty of the first death.
And because they bypass the spiritual core of the first death, they are completely secure from ever facing the second death. John 5:24 seems to support that.
Exactly. Their physical death lacks the terror of judgment because the penalty has already been paid by their substitute. Hashtag 2.3 resurrection as confirmation of innocence.
Which leads logically to the resurrection. If death couldn't hold him because he was sinless, then the resurrection isn't just a miracle. It's like the cosmos issuing a receipt.
That's a great way to put it. It's the ultimate confirmation, the cosmic proof. Christ was made sin for us, as 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, and he bore the curse of the law, Galatians 3:13. But, and this is the critical distinction, he himself did not commit sin.
He paid the debt, but he wasn't personally liable.
Precisely. So the moment that substitutionary payment was complete, the moment he bore the abandonment necessitated by our sin, the law had absolutely no further claim on the sinless substitute. Its demands were met.
So the very structure of the cosmos, the law he upheld, demanded his release. It wasn't just the Father intervening miraculously. It was the universe's own legal structure saying, he's innocent, he must be released.
Exactly. Because he did not sin, the universal cosmic law, the very structure he created and perfectly obeyed, decreed that death has zero power to detain him. His resurrection therefore serves multiple purposes. It proves his personal innocence, it affirms the absolute truth and righteousness of the commandments he kept, and it validates the entire substitutionary sacrifice. Romans 1:4 links his resurrection to his being declared the Son of God in power.
It's the Father's public testimony through the resurrection that the Son's obedience as a creature was perfect, the payment was accepted, and the law, far from being overturned, was actually upheld and vindicated by that obedience.
Perfectly stated. He conquered death, not by ignoring the law, but by flawlessly fulfilling it, thereby proving he was uniquely worthy to rule by that very law.
Which leads us straight into the next big question. Why was all this necessary? What's the grand strategy behind creating beings who would need this kind of intervention in the first place? The purpose of the dust body.
Okay, we're shifting gears now from the mechanics of the sacrifice to the grand cosmic strategy behind it all. The sources seem to suggest that creating humanity in these physical, temporary, flawed bodies wasn't an accident or an afterthought. It was part of a deliberate, universe-spanning test.
That's right. And to understand the test, we first need to grasp the different types of bodies the sources talk about.
You mentioned this earlier. There's the psychical body.
Yes, the psychikon soma. That's the soul and flesh body, the natural body we have now. It's animated by the psyche, the soul. This is contrasted with the pneumaticon soma, the spiritual body. 1 Corinthians 15:44-46 lays this out. So there's a progression implied. The first Adam, representing humanity initially, had the psychical body earthly, animated by soul, subject to decay, desires, limitations.
Correct. Then Christ, called the last Adam, became a life-giving spirit. He pioneers the transition to the spiritual body. 1 Corinthians 15.4546, again. This suggests the spiritual body is the ultimate intended form.
The goal state for redeemed humanity.
It seems to be the ultimate goal, yes. But according to these sources, it's a restricted upgrade, if you will. There seems to be a conscious divine decision behind who gets clothed with these superior, incorruptible spiritual bodies.
And the criteria.
The sources suggest God decided to grant these spiritual bodies only to those proven loyal, those who would demonstrably never sin again. They become truly equal to the angels, as Luke 20.3536 puts it, in the sense of being beyond the reach of death and future rebellion.
Okay, but why the restriction? Why not just start everyone out with these perfect spiritual bodies like the angels presumably had, if the goal is a perfect creation?
But look what happened with the angels. Even with superior bodies, direct knowledge of God, dwelling in his presence, a significant portion of them still fell. They still chose rebellion.
Right, so having a spiritual body doesn't automatically guarantee loyalty.
Exactly. And if God had created Adam with a spiritual body right off the bat, and then Adam had fallen, the whole cosmic test, the verification of God's commandments that we're discussing, could have been undermined.
How so?
The counter-argument could always be made, perhaps by Satan or other doubters. Well, of course they fell. They were flawed creations. Maybe the spiritual bodies weren't perfect enough. Maybe there was some inherent defect. It leaves an excuse.
Okay, I see. So the psychical, flawed, temporary dust body becomes the critical element. It removes the excuses. It becomes the necessary vehicle for the ultimate verification. Hashtag 3.2, the test of the commandment's truth.
Precisely. The core argument in these sources is that the entire reason for creating humanity in this specific form, weak, vulnerable, subject to decay, filled with conflicting desires, made from dust, was to conclusively, definitively verify the truth and righteousness of God's commandments before the entire watching universe. Job 1.8 is often pointed to as a prime example of this test beginning.
This is the absolute heart of their cosmological argument, isn't it? The why behind human existence.
It really is. Let's dig into Satan's challenge a bit more because it sets the stage. What was his actual accusation against God's rule? Why did it necessitate such a complex, time-consuming, frankly painful verification process involving billions of human lives in these fragile bodies?
What's the core of his claim?
Satan's challenge, as exemplified in Job, is fundamentally this. Creatures cannot and will not keep God's commandments purely out of love or genuine free will. His assertion is that any obedience is motivated by self-interest, either seeking reward or fearing punishment.
So he's basically accusing God of ruling by coercion or bribery, not by genuine, freely reciprocated love and justice.
Exactly. He's implying God's rule is tyrannical because his laws are fundamentally unlivable for creatures acting freely. Therefore, Satan argues, God's claim to rightful sovereignty is illegitimate. He wants to dethrone God, whose entire basis for rule rests on his commandments being perfectly righteous, just, and crucially, livable. Job 1.811 shows Satan making this exact bet.
Okay, so the cosmic gauntlet is thrown down, the law itself is on trial, and humanity in its weakest form becomes the testing ground.
That's the structural logic presented. The law must be proven true, proven livable, under the harshest possible conditions. If human beings burdened by this cursed dust body with all its inherent weaknesses and corrupting desires, Paul talks about this struggle in Romans 7 and 8.
Right, the flesh warring against the spirit.
Yes, if these creatures can still genuinely choose to keep the core commandments specifically, loving God supremely and loving their neighbor, even extending to loving enemies, as Matthew 5.4344 commands.
Which seems almost impossible on a flawed body.
Almost. But if it can be done, even by some, then the commandments are proven inherently livable, inherently good, and perfectly just. 1 John 5.3 says, his commandments are not burdensome. This demonstration completely dismantles Satan's core accusation that they are impossible or tyrannical.
So the faithfulness of someone like Job, enduring suffering in a weak body without cursing God, isn't just a personal story, it's cosmic evidence entered into the record.
It's presented as irrefutable proof. Job's faithfulness, especially after Satan takes everything away, health, family, wealth, demonstrating it wasn't just about the rewards, Job 2.310, verifies the livability of the commandment to fear God even in suffering. And this verification, seen by the watching angels and other created beings, is essential for their free will to be completed too.
How does it complete their free will?
Because they witness definitive proof that God is not only powerful, but fundamentally righteous and his laws are just. It resolves any lingering doubts they might have had about the fairness of God's rule, especially after seeing some of their own kind fall. John 12.28:31 hints at this cosmic audience and judgment. This ensures their continued obedience is based on fully informed consent, rooted in the absolute knowledge of God's perfect justice and love, not just fear or obligation.
Without this human test, there would always be this potential question mark, this point of cosmic friction regarding God's character and laws. The dust body is designed to resolve that friction permanently.
Precisely. The dust body, subject to pain, temptation, sickness, death, and those powerful fleshly desires, provides the maximum possible resistance to obedience. It's the ultimate stress test. If obedience, motivated by love, is possible here, in this state, then Satan has no argument left. It proves the commandments are inherently good and achievable through reliance on God's Spirit. Hashtag 3.3, the predetermination of Adam and the cross.
This whole setup, the dust body, the cosmic test, the role of Satan, it sounds incredibly intricate. So intricate that you might think it was, God's reaction plan. Plan B, put into motion after the angels fell, but the sources strongly argue against that.
Absolutely not. They insist this wasn't improvisation. This entire process, including Adam's creation in a dust body and the necessity of the cross, was planned before the foundation of the world, before creation even began.
Ephesians 3.9 talks about the mystery hidden for ages in God, and Ephesians 1.9:11 speaks of his plans set forth in Christ before time began.
Correct. And 1 Corinthians 2.7 speaks of God's hidden wisdom, ordained before the ages for our glory, which contextually refers to the plan culminating in the cross. This relies heavily on the understanding that God exists outside of and simultaneous to all of time.
He sees the end from the beginning. Revelation 22.13, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Colossians 3.11, Christ is all and in all.
Exactly. So, from God's perspective, existing in all moments at once, he knew the angels would fall. Psalm 139.16 suggests God knew all our days before one of them came to be applied cosmically. He knew the course of creation. Therefore, the solution creating humanity in dust bodies for the test and the eventual sacrifice of Christ wasn't a reaction, it was integrated into the initial blueprint of creation itself. The timing of the angelic fall didn't necessitate the plan anticipated the need for verification from the outset. Job 38.4 asks Job where he was when God laid the earth's foundation, implying the plan predates even angelic observation.
Wow. So the creation of the dust body wasn't primarily a punishment for Adam's future sin. It was the chosen instrument planned from eternity, specifically designed to complete the free will of the angels by demonstrating the truth and to definitively prove the righteousness of the commandments.
It was a perfect stage for the cosmic challenge. Think about it. If Adam had started as a perfected, powerful, spiritual being like the angels, his obedience might still have been questioned. He's naturally good, perhaps. But creating humanity as fragile, physical beings, inherently prone to failure, yet capable of choosing love and faithfulness through God's grace, that sets up the ultimate, undeniable test of God's law and character.
And this test directly confronts and refutes Satan's core ideology, his accusation against God.
It is the systemic, irrefutable rebuttal. Satan claimed creatures couldn't or wouldn't serve God genuinely, without compulsion or reward. The perfect obedience of Christ in a creaturely dust body, followed by the voluntary faithfulness of countless believers in their own weak bodies throughout history. This whole process exposes Satan for what Revelation 12.10 calls him, the accuser, the liar, whose foundational claim is false.
Once that verification is complete, once the law is undeniably shown to be true and livable,
then the final phase of God's plan for creation can proceed. But the verification had to come first.
So, the ultimate purpose of human existence in this framework is far grander than just individual salvation. It's to serve as the key witnesses in a cosmic trial, verifying the righteousness of God's rule for all eternity.
And it's this very verification, this proven righteousness, that clears the path for the next great paradox. The Creator needing to formally inherit the control he already inherently possesses.
Okay, back to what feels like the most challenging paradox in this whole structure. Why on earth did the Creator need to inherit authority? The sources are clear. The second Godhead, the Son, is co-equal with the Father, right? Philippians 2.6.
Yes, co-equal in nature and essence.
And together, they created everything. Space, time, angels, humans, everything. Colossians 1.16, 1 Corinthians 8.6 confirm this. That means death and Hades, as created entities or realms within that structure, inherently belong to him already. Romans 8.38, again, nothing created can separate. John 1.1, all things made through him.
Logically, yes, he has ontological ownership.
So, if he already owns it all, why the big ceremony, essentially after the resurrection, where he receives the keys to death and Hades? Revelation 1.1 and 18. Why the need to inherit what's already his?
It comes back to the distinction between inherent ontological ownership and, let's call it legally confirmed, publicly ratified authority within the understanding of the created order.
Okay, unpack that distinction.
His ownership as creator is absolute, eternal, undeniable from a divine perspective. But remember the mission. He voluntarily subjected himself to the created order, became a creature, lived under the law. Why? To answer the cosmic challenge, to complete the free will of other creatures by demonstrating perfect justice and love from within the system.
If he had just asserted his authority as creator, bypassing the whole obedience and sacrifice process.
The doubters, the accusers, the creatures whose free will wasn't yet complete could always argue, well, of course, he can rule. He made the rules. He stands outside them. It doesn't prove the rules are fair or just for us creatures.
It would look like raw power, not necessarily a righteous authority validated under the law.
Exactly. To prove the law was perfectly just and binding for everyone, including potentially rebellious creatures, the lawmaker himself had to voluntarily become the ultimate creature, enter the system, obey the law perfectly, and even submit to its penalty on behalf of others. The inheritance, then, is the cosmic legal payoff for that perfect submission as a creature. It's the universe acknowledging his earned right to rule within the system he validated. Hashtag 4.2, self-emptying and official succession.
Let's talk about that self-emptying, the kenosis mentioned in Philippians 2.67. How did that act, according to these sources, structurally require a subsequent inheritance?
The kenosis is understood here as the second Godhead voluntarily setting aside the outward display and independent exercise of his co-equal divine prerogatives. He didn't stop being God, but he chose to operate within the limitations of genuine humanity.
He put himself under the very laws he created.
Precisely. By doing that, he intentionally placed himself in a structural position where, according to the rules of his own creation roles, he himself designed and validated he must receive authority back from the Father. But this time, he receives it not just as the inherent creator, but as the triumphant, perfectly obedient God-man.
So he didn't lose his deity, but he functionally operated under a constrained, delegated, creaturely authority, like we talked about in Section 1. His actions were always representing the Father's will.
That's the absolute key. By becoming the perfect creature, the perfect representative, he earned the title and the right to governance within the created system in a way that all other creatures could recognize as legitimate according to the now validated law.
And the cross, followed by the resurrection, becomes the official confirmation, the public ceremony.
Exactly. It's the formal ratification of this earned inheritance. Matthew 28:18, after the resurrection. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. It signifies the successful completion of the mission and the Father's official bestowal of recognized rule upon the Son in his capacity as the victorious God-man.
It's maybe like a king who owns the kingdom by birthright, but the coronation is the necessary public legal act that formally installs him and validates his reign in the eyes of the people and according to the kingdom's laws. The inheritance wasn't about him gaining power he didn't already possess inherently, but about the public legal ratification of that power.
That's a very helpful analogy. The cross and resurrection solidified his status as Lord and Christ the Master in the understanding and acceptance of all creatures. Acts 2.36 makes this point forcefully after Pentecost. It confirmed his temporary voluntary subordination was complete, and his demonstrated righteousness as the perfect creature now entitled him to exercise the full authority of the Creator, but now vested in his glorified human nature.
And we should be crystal clear here. Even during that period of self-limitation, even as a baby in a manger, he was still inherently God and deserved worship.
Absolutely. The sources are clear on that. Hebrews 1.6 says the angels were commanded to worship him when he was brought into the world. Luke 2.11, the angels announce his birth as Savior, who is Christ the Lord. His inherent status didn't change. The inheritance process was about making his rightful rule undeniable and validated by the law itself for the sake of the created order. Hashtag 4.3, the role of the cross and legitimacy.
Okay, but why was the cross specifically the linchpin for this legitimacy? Couldn't the Father have just declared, okay, mission accomplished, he obeyed perfectly, now he officially rules, without the horrific suffering and death?
It comes back again to the free will of the creatures observing, particularly the fallen angels and potentially skeptical humans throughout history. If Christ had bypassed the cross, if he had just assumed full, overt control and judgment before paying the ultimate price, the most crucial piece of evidence would be missing.
The evidence of God's love.
Exactly. And his justice, demonstrated in the costliest way possible. Creatures would have seen his perfect obedience, yes. They would have seen his power. but they wouldn't have seen the depth of God's love willing to suffer with and for his creation. They wouldn't have seen the ultimate expression of his justice, satisfying the law's demands through substitution rather than just waiving them.
They'd see power and righteousness, maybe, but not necessarily sacrificial love demonstrated under the law's own penalty.
That's the argument. The cross is the definitive, undeniable, ultimate proof of God's love. Romans 5:8. God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It's the moment the Creator subjects himself in the person of the Son to the direst consequences of his own law, proving he's willing to pay the absolute highest price to uphold justice and redeem his creation. This act is what finally silences all legitimate objections. It eliminates the creature's final misunderstandings, their lingering doubts, their potential accusations about God's character, or the fairness of his governance.
It's the ultimate checkmate move in the cosmic argument. The moment of seeming maximum weakness and defeat becomes the moment of maximum moral and legal legitimacy.
Beautifully put. Once that sacrifice is understood, once the free will of creatures is completed by witnessing this ultimate display of love fused with justice, then and only then can he formally receive the name that is above every name. Philippians 2:8-11 links his humiliation and death directly to his exaltation and universal lordship. Every creature, angelic, human, demonic, can then submit to him without any reservation, without any future basis for rebellion, because his right to rule has been established beyond any possible dispute.
So the inheritance isn't just bestowed, it's acknowledged universally as perfectly righteous. The submission of every knee becomes an act of informed, willing consent for the righteous, and a compelled, undeniable acknowledgement of just authority for the rebellious.
Precisely. It's based on verified truth, perfect justice, and now fully demonstrated infinite love.
All right, so we've arrived at the point where the two critical pieces of cosmic evidence are locked in place. First, the truth and livability of God's commandments have been proven under the harshest conditions the weak human dust body. Section 3.
Check. Verified by Christ and his followers.
Second, God's perfect justice and his profound love have been demonstrated and legally satisfied through the necessary transaction of the cross and resurrection. Section 4.
Check. The Creator submitted to his own law's penalty.
So, with both the law validated and God's character vindicated, what's the structural result? How does this clear the path for the final stages, particularly judgment? Hashtag tag 5.1 judgment based on verified commandments.
The result is essentially cosmic certainty, absolute clarity. Because the truth, the righteousness, and the livability of the commandments are now proven beyond any possible cosmic or legal challenge, they are firmly, unshakably established as the basis, the criterion for final judgment. Revelation 11.1 shows the Ark of the Covenant, representing God's law, visible in heaven right before the final judgments pour out.
The standard is set and universally acknowledged as fair.
Exactly. When the final judgment comes, no creature, whether angel or human, can stand up and legitimately argue this law was unfair, or obedience was impossible, or God is unjust. That argument has been systematically dismantled by the entire process we've discussed, culminating in Christ.
So the validation process provides the necessary legal and moral foundation for judgment to be executed without any question of its righteousness.
That's the structural protection it affords. There is zero ambiguity left in the universe regarding the fairness of the divine law or the character of the lawgiver. This clears the way, morally and legally, for the judgment of those who willfully disobeyed the verified commandments, those criminals who rejected God's authority and often oppressed their neighbors in the process. Revelation 11.1518 and 16.57 speak of this judgment being righteous because the law was rejected.
And this righteous judgment leads inevitably to the final purification of the cosmos.
Yes. The ultimate consequence described for the unrepentantly wicked is the lake of fire, the second death. Within this framework, it's presented not just as punishment, but as a necessary cosmic cleansing. It's the final, required step to completely extinguish sin and rebellion from space and time. 1 Corinthians 15.25 says Christ must reign until all enemies are under his feet, the last enemy being death itself. Revelation 20.1114 describes this final judgment leading to the second death. It's the necessary outcome once the proof of righteousness is complete and the choice to reject it is finalized.
The completion of God's intended creation requires the permanent removal of the moral contaminant of sin. Hashtag tag 5.2, the three harvests, first fruits.
And the sources suggest this whole process of verification and the gathering of those who pass the test isn't just one final event. It unfolds in stages marked by specific harvests or first fruits. These act like Well, like tangible proof points, verification checkpoints within history, showing the plan is working and progressing as designed.
Okay, let's quickly detail these three main harvests mentioned.
The first, and obviously the most important, is Christ himself. He is explicitly called the first fruits of those who've fallen asleep in 1 Corinthians 15:20. His resurrection is the absolute foundational proof. It demonstrates that the penalty could be paid, death could be overcome, and the new, perfected spiritual body is a reality. He's the first one harvested from death into eternal life.
He proves the concept. Okay, the second harvest.
Pentecost. This is seen as the first fruits of the Spirit within humanity, as Romans 8:23 suggests. The coming of the Holy Spirit marks the beginning of the ecclesia, the called-out assembly. This is the initial gathering on earth of the group who have accepted the verified law, embraced the sacrifice, and received the divine power, the Spirit enabling them to start living righteously, even while still in the weak dust body. They represent the successful start of the cosmic test completion on a broader human scale.
The first wave of successful test subjects, if you will, and the third harvest.
This one is more specific, often identified with the 144,000 described in Revelation, particularly in chapter 14. They are explicitly called first fruits unto God and to the Lamb, redeemed from mankind, Rev 14:3-4. The interpretation here is that their number reaching completion signifies the final accumulation of the required proof. They represent the full quota, the designated number of witnesses whose faithfulness, often under extreme tribulation, implied also perhaps in Rev 6:9-11, the souls under the altar asking how long, provides the final definitive verification that the law is livable and God is righteous. Once their number is full, the cosmic experiment is deemed complete, triggering the final end-time judgments.
So these aren't just random historical or future events. They are structured milestones in the cosmic plan, each providing concrete historical evidence that God's system of law, grace, and transformation actually works, validating the entire process before the final judgment. Hashtag 5.3, the elimination of sin and the completion of creation.
Exactly. They're integral parts of the verification. The ultimate end goal, once the free will of the righteous is fully confirmed and aligned with God, and once the unrepentant criminals are finally judged according to the now verified law, is the complete elimination of sin and its effects from creation. Revelation 21:4 promises no more death, mourning, crying, or pain. The universe achieves its perfected, intended state.
Before we conclude, let's just reinforce that definition of death one last time, because it's so fundamental to understanding salvation and judgment in this specific framework.
Absolutely. Let's clarify the two death states again. The first death, remember, encompasses earthly death, the physical body returning to dust. This happens even to the righteous, like Moses, Deuteronomy 34:7.
Yeah.
But for them, because of Christ, this physical event is reframed as merely sleep. Why? Because the sting, the spiritual consequence, is removed. Their soul, their psyche, is not cut off from God.
The real death, the one to fear, is the spiritual separation.
That's the core of it. The true death is being spiritually severed from God, who is the source of all life. Revelation 3:1 speaks of those who have a reputation for being alive, but are actually dead spiritually. Those who are united with Christ are saved from this true death, because he experienced the spiritual consequence, the abandonment death, in their place.
So they escape the spiritual severance that is the defining feature of the first death for the lost, and therefore they will never ever face the second death.
Correct. However, those who reject Christ remain in the state of first death. They are already spiritually cut off from God's life due to sin, even while physically alive. Their physical death simply confirms this state, and because they remain under the law's condemnation, they are then rightfully subjected to the final permanent severance.
Yeah.
The second death, the lake of fire, as Revelation 20:1-14 describes.
So to bring this incredibly complex, detailed, and frankly challenging framework to a conclusion, the sources compel us to see Christ's sinlessness not just as a commendable quality or a moral ideal,
But as the absolute structurally mandatory condition for creation's purpose to be fulfilled, perhaps even for creation to exist sustainably at all.
Explain that last part, why mandatory for existence.
Because if Christ, the Word, Logos, through whom all things were made, John 1:1-3, had sinned, if he had failed the test while in creature form, it would have proven the foundational principle of creation, God's law and character, to be flawed. It would mean the Word itself wasn't absolute truth. If the Word, the organizing principle of reality, contained falsehood or failed its own standard, how could the creation structured upon it hold together? His perfect sinlessness was therefore structurally required to ensure the validity of his substitutionary sacrifice, to confirm the eternal truth and righteousness of the commandments, and ultimately to allow God's grand, predetermined plan of verification and cosmic completion to succeed. Without his perfection, the whole structure arguably collapses.
Wow. Okay, that brings us to the end of a really deep dive today. We've essentially tried to re-engineer our view, looking at theology almost as a form of cosmic law and systemic necessity. We've traced how Christ's perfect obedience as a creature wasn't just about setting a good example,
Not at all.
but was a necessary cosmic transaction. It legally validated God's law, it confirmed God's justice and love in a way nothing else could, and it formally, publicly confirmed his legitimate reign over all space and time, acknowledged finally by all creation.
A huge amount to take in, I know. My final thought, perhaps something for you, the listener, to really chew on is this. Reflect deeply on the assertion raised by these sources that a universe structured around moral law, around the concepts of justice and righteousness, simply could not have been created, or perhaps could not be structurally sustained, unless the word Christ was inherently, absolutely truth, and therefore absolutely without sin.
You're suggesting the very act of creation presupposed his perfection.
The sources seem to argue that way, that the act of creation itself, the very beginning of space and time, was contingent upon the foreknown, perfect, predetermined sacrifice and guaranteed success of the sinless creator stepping into creature form. It suggests the cross isn't just God's solution to a problem that arose in creation. It's the underlying truth, the foundational validation that made the creation of a moral universe possible in the first place. Something to think about.